Aidan,
Yes.
are we able to see the participants, the attendees, or is this?
Nope. It's currently just going to be the two panelists. So you and Sheila will be the ones who are visible, and everyone else will be hidden.
I see. And that's the case for the Q&A as well?
Yes, we can give people the opportunity to speak at the very end, if that's what you would like, or people can ask questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen.
And we're good to go. We're live already.
Okay. All right, so I guess we'll start. Hello, bonjour, bonjour, tanses, hego. Thank you for taking the time to join us for today's talk titled A Living Practice, Landscape Architecture Adaptations, which is part of the Daniels Faculty online lecture series. My name is Leah Margolis, and I'm the director of the Master of Landscape Architecture program at the Daniels Faculty. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce today's speaker and a very dear colleague and collaborator, Sheila Boudreau. Sheila is a founder, owner, and principal of SpruceLAB, which is based here in Toronto. It's a social enterprise, and she is a proudly of Canadian, Mi'kmaq, and Celtic descent. She's a landscape architect and registered professional planner with over 25 years of professional experience divided between the private and public sectors. Her education includes undergraduate degrees in landscape architecture and fine art from the University of Guelph and a Master's of Arts in Planning from the University of Waterloo. Sheila combines her collaborative community and nature-based practice with advocacy, teaching, and creative research. Previously, she led the landscape architecture team at the TRCA, Toronto Region Conservation Authority, where she initiated and co-founded with myself and a few other colleagues, Nikabita Wadina Gigwag Indigenous Youth Employment and Training Program, which now has a home base at the Daniels Faculty. As an urban designer at the City of Toronto, she was responsible for a wide range of civic projects that were really pioneering and ahead of the game, and initiated and co-led the Green Streets initiatives. Prior to that, at DTAH, she worked on a variety of precedent-setting projects such as Waterfront Toronto's Water Edge Promenade and Evergreen Brickworks. She teaches at Ryerson University, and this term we're so lucky to have her teaching our MLA option studio, one of our MLA option studios for our third year MLA students, titled Our Plant Relations and Decolonizing Design. The format for today's event will be via Zoom. Our chat will be open, and if you have any questions, I ask that you please post them in the Q&A section of your Zoom window, and we'll try to answer them at the end of the lecture. I now welcome our speaker today, Sheila Boudreau. Thank you, Miigwech.
Thanks, Liat. That was very kind. I just want to say it's an honor to be here. And I'm seeing this more, less of a lecture, but more of a sharing of stories. And I wanted to start with a land acknowledgement that was shared with me from the Southern Ontario Nature Coalition. Since time immemorial, the Indigenous peoples were self-reliant and well provided for through their own ingenuity and use of the gifts of the land, living in harmony with the balance of nature. I acknowledge that the land we meet on today and strive to protect is the territory of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee peoples, and now is home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. I also want to acknowledge Nukumis Gizik, Grand Cedar, or Huguski, cedar trees, the grandmothers that raised me. Cedars are a symbol of balance, the tree of life. They're a powerful, protective medicine. This is the landscape that I grew up in rural Halton Hills. From the time I was very young, I was very connected to plants. I think I thought they were my friends. They were my friends. I listened to them. I played with them. And I remember distinctly the time I found a bright blue robin's egg that had fallen from my favorite apple tree, the side of the road, and a tiny little bird inside that didn't make it. And I remember feeling empathy to that wee life and thinking about, even though I was very young, about how fragile life is. Today, I wanted to share my stories of my years of practice in a way that honored plants and was inspired by them. And it made me think about practice and the saying of practice makes perfect, and how this just is not a helpful way to be and to work. And I looked through Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer's books, and she's such an inspiration and a scholar and well-regarded, gives talks. If you can ever hear her speak, she's amazing. And this quote really resonated with me. She writes that our stories from the oldest days tell about the time when all beings shared a common language, thrushes, trees, mosses, and humans. But that language has been long forgotten. So we learn each other's stories by looking, by watching each other's ways of being, ways of living. Gizus, Wab, sunflower. Sunflowers stand tall and proud. They grow in communities. They prefer sunny locations. In fact, they turn their bright yellow heads to face the sun, to face the light and the heat. They're happy, carefree, sway in the wind together. I always feel like they're expecting good news to be shared. When I was starting out in landscape architecture during my undergrad, I was very interested in community and sustainable design. And I focused on co-housing and the idea of people designing in their own communities. And I worked with a group in Waterloo that had this idea and focused the project on an area where watersheds and water issues were of great concern. I was really excited about the idea of community plantings. I worked at the City of Waterloo for years part-time and after my undergrad, and focused on creek revegetation and education in schools and with nonprofits about the importance of plants and trees and helping create cleaner waterways. This is where I learned about bioengineering. Green infrastructure was the first that hadn't been actually talked about at that time. I was really lucky to work on projects like the Waterloo Recreation Complex, where back in the early 90s, we were designing and installing infiltration trenches, which we would now say bioswales. They're still thriving today. One of my earliest lessons was actually the Canadian Clay and Glass Gallery. The voice of the community was not happy about the fact that this beautiful award-winning building was not giving back in terms of public realm. And as a young landscape architect, I was asked to work with the community to redesign what was really an expansive monoculture of Kentucky bluegrass with concrete plinths into what we decided would be a wrapping of the building of Laurel Creek, which actually runs just to the north of this site. This site today is filled with ornamental grasses, large sweeps of stones, and is one of the most photographed places to go. It was intimidating for me to be working at this scale at this early time, especially given the resistance of the architectural community at the time. In fact, a letter was even written from the Daniels School protesting the changing of this landscape. But the community was right. It needed to be theirs. I was also pretty excited about the idea of new urbanism, although cautiously so. The ideas of taking higher density living walkable communities, vernacular approach, and MBTW and Walker Not Dragicevic, while I was just finishing my master's degree, I got to work on projects like this, but it was still greenfield conversion, and I couldn't continue to work in that way. I ended up doing my master's of planning at Waterloo, focusing on integrating water, land, and community, and the Don watershed as a case study, looking at the communities that came together across the region. Through that research, I found some recommendations based on key informant interviews and deep conversations that have resonated throughout my practice. The need to be strategic, political, innovative, flexible, and adaptive, to be aware of what people need and want, to be facilitating opportunities for learning and this common sense of belonging, and to work with existing institutional arrangements in order to make change, and balancing flexibility with a sense of stability. Apequeshque, common cattail. Cattails are used as food sources. The roots are ground into flour. The seeds are actually, the fluff is turned into pillows and duvets. They sway in the wind. They stand tall and protect. They're known as the warriors, the defenders of the shore. The most important thing, which I just missed, not most important, an important thing to me in terms of plants and what they help us with in healing the land is cattails are one of the most important plants for phytoremediation. They actually remove heavy metals and they clean the soil as well as the water. Evergreen Brickworks was a project that took this idea of resilience and working with nature to, I think, probably the highest level I have seen in projects I've worked on. The flows of energy, people, water through these lands have been talked about for a long time. Decades of people working to convert what was an old brick factory into a place of sustainability were championed by citizens, the task force to bring back the dawn, and many, many landscape architects. It was Evergreen who took the idea of bringing headquarters and searching with the different levels of government to find funding. This is a picture that shows what it used to look like. And this is the master plan that we were working from. When I was at DTAH and working with Claude Cormier's office, building on the work that had been done, we were tasked with turning this vision into a reality. Green ribbons that flow through the space and a site that could change with the flooding and create space for people, humans, animals, biodiversity. We worked very closely with Dugan and Associates ecologists. This is a picture of the early installation. This is just recently. It is a thriving place that is resilient in times of flooding. It has families that come to look for animals, children feel safe. I talk to parents there who let their kids ride their bikes on the circles. And if you look closely, you'll see that there's an interconnected system of stormwater management that actually helps make the space perform when we think of terms of green infrastructure. There are bioswales, there's permeable concrete. These were newer technologies at the time when it was constructed, and there were lessons learned, but in terms of stormwater management, this site performs, and the people can come and continue to learn about biodiversity and It's connected to the bike system. It has really become a loved place in Toronto. Many people bring their family and friends here as a destination. The farmers market is thriving. And in these bioswales, it's amazing to see, this is early on when the plants were planted in the lower left corner, how green and verdant this place has become in such a short time. This was, I think, about 10 years later. Waterfront Toronto is another project I was really fortunate to work on with Jim at Urban, looking at soil cells and the idea of taking care of the trees' needs from the terms of water, soil, protecting the soil from compaction, at the same time creating an amazing public realm. The design was led by West 8 with DTH working on the detailed construction, and my role was really the trees. I helped with details, but I was focused on securing and working with the nurseries to create, grow, harvest, and bring these trees to the waterfront. And this is me, my mom took this picture, literally a tree hugger. These trees are thriving. This project has people as well. It's been turned into an incredible oasis at the foot of the city at the water's edge. It's a success story in terms of us planning for and caring for green infrastructure. Sugar beech trees wrap around the corner. These are all trees that I got to handpick from the nurseries and worked with other consultants at the same time, but the trees was such a joy to be working with. At DTH, I was also fortunate to work on university projects where we had many students coming and going, very detailed details like seeding and paving, but also thinking about the plantings and the movement and the people places. And working on daycare center, one I worked on was St. Andrew's Child Care Center. And one of the things that I was most proud of it was the nature play, but also the fact that this site had been created so that it would be infiltrating water, would be useful for the children all year because it wouldn't be flooded. It was designed to drain and water the trees and the plants. And it has become a place to go to learn about nature-based play. The City of Toronto, I worked in urban design for 6 years, and I had been working at DTH on tree planting solutions, this manual, and then internally looking at the kinds of options we had to help our trees on our street conditions, which are very hard conditions for trees to grow in, what the different options were, the costs involved, and how we could make this happen. I was thinking a lot at that time about stormwater management and about taking those street tree details to another level. How could we get the water to our trees? The Toronto Green Standard has standards, measures in place for private development, but also capital projects. And I had been thinking a lot about the quality of the water where we live. This is a picture of my children, probably about 5 years ago. And even though it's idyllic, they're sitting beside a creek that is heavily polluted from stormwater runoff, combined sewer overflows. We need to find ways to protect our waters, our aquatic habitat. And a very important way to do that is green infrastructure. So at the City of Toronto, with the capital that I had, I started to look for opportunities to work with Toronto Water stormwater engineers, specifically a fellow named Patrick Chung, and also the Toronto Green Standard team under Jane Welsh and Shayna Stott. And we looked at opportunities to convert these hardscape scenarios, which is actually, this particular project was championed by the community. That's a pilot project showing that the sky wouldn't fall if we took away this traffic island. And we converted it, working together with our engineering colleagues, into a place that could be and is filled with people now. And these trees are about twice that size. I need to update this photo, but this project has been talked about quite a lot. It's so small. It's seems like such a small for such an impact. This little girl, her mother told me they go there every day to look for butterflies and to be in close contact with the bees. And there were Jane's walks. This is me and Patrick, and this is Councillor Fletcher. The community wants to see more of these kinds of places. They're interested in understanding urban hydrology and how to bring biodiversity into our communities. There was even a film that was done about resilience in the city, and they focused on Fairford Ave in one of their 4 films. So why don't we see more of these projects? It's complicated. The right-of-way has many stakeholders. This image comes from the Complete Streets work that was underway while I was at the city that shows, you can imagine the discussions that happen between the water department, the business improvement areas, and so on. The team I was working with thought about complexity and wondered how we could put together a graphic that described the systems that need to be working together in an integrated way. And we saw it as being a message of a lens of working through planning, coordination, training and outreach and implementation. And we were working on new standards. So we call them the Green Streets Technical Guidelines in this box. And the Toronto Green Standards for the right-of-way was another word we were using. And we could really only just touch on these bolder blocks of work. The cities need to have people working full-time on these projects to move them forward, but we were successful at working on the Green Street Guidelines, which are now being implemented by working groups, although slowed down by COVID. One of the things I got to work on, this was actually designed by David Dennis Architects at DTAH. And the idea that I wanted to champion at the city was we were planting 140 trees on the Danforth, part of my capital project. How are we protecting these trees? How are we protecting the soil? And we developed this system, modular system with the help of David. And it really has changed the streetscape. But the other thing I was worried about was who's caring for these trees. When you think of the life cycles of our plants and we put them out and we leave them, they may get watered, but maybe they're not. So LEAF agreed, Urban Forestry agreed, it was a concern. And together we found funding, we applied for funding and created an Adopt a Street Tree program. And this is a picture of me, my colleague Olivia, and a friend taking care of the tree on the Danforth in front of where we work. I worked at the Toronto Region Conservation Authority and closely with the Sustainable Technologies Evaluation Program, but to support the organization overall. And one of the most interesting projects I was able to help advance was the Meadowway, the conversion of 16 kilometers of the Gatineau Hydro Corridor into places for people and pollinators that tie into so many communities along the way. And we decided that the best way to help support the environmental assessment underway was a visualization toolkit. Perkins and Will has been working on that. I left TRCA when I was offered a job at a company called Emmons and Olivier Resources Canada Inc. that were expanding their office. They're experts in green infrastructure, and I knew I would learn a lot from the engineers and the ecologists that lead this work. Unfortunately, I was there for 1 year, but COVID hit and things were slowed down. At the same time, though, I had been thinking about creating my own practice, probably for about a year. So the timing was a good one to move on and to think about the next steps and the new adaptations in my career path. Manoomin, wild rice. My friend Gary Pritchard gave me these images. These are from Mitchell Lake, and you can see how the rice has a pointed end, but this part also has a corkscrew shape. Gary says that wild rice, they found wild rice that fell from the banks of the lake that they tested and found that it was 1,000 years old. What happens is the rice digs into the soil and the corkscrew makes it go deep. It's like a gift from the ancestors. It still nourishes the people, even 2,000 years later. It's seen as a symbol of cultural resurgence. When I think about going deep, I'm thinking again about my family. This is a picture of my daughter when she was young, working on this community gardens, converting our children community school into an outdoor classroom. And in the green infrastructure work I had been working on at the city, it wasn't just about the stormwater, it's about the people, it's about the communities that live there. This is a traffic island and a turning lane that will be converted into a park, into a little parkette space. And yes, it will take the stormwater and it will water the trees. But what about the sacredness of water? What about the connections of people to the land that live in this local community? I started to work with the schools through the Toronto District School Board Eco Schools program and the Roden School Public School. I went in and explained to them what it was we were doing with Raindrop Plaza, what were the plans, and they developed this beautiful graphic to be put in the center, the space here, the semicircle, to tell the story of the work that the trees do for us. And they worked with Dan Bergeron, an artist in the school. I also, through teacher Amber Quayle, worked with Wandering Spirit School and asked the school, how would they like to contribute to the project? And they decided that with Elder Shirt and Amber, they would have an after-school traditional beading program. So there was in-ceremony teachings while they were working on the beading, and the beading would turn into giant art panels that would be installed at the project. Nibi, this is water in Anishinaabe. Water is the blood of Mother Earth. It's not just stormwater. So I've been thinking a lot about, as a landscape architect, working on projects, the importance of reaching out to our youth and to have opportunities to find interdisciplinary collaborations, because this is how we will change things. Working with communities, working with Indigenous communities, working with different disciplines around the green infrastructure sector. But how do we teach that when the accreditation boards are so specific for each of the disciplines? So we decided to try with a hackathon. Ryerson Urban Water supported this. I'm now on the board of advisors, and we focused on a few key things, which I try to take into my teaching: listening deeply, mentoring and collaborating with others, and innovating, thinking outside the box and teaching this back and sharing. This model worked well, and Ryerson Urban Water decided to do a professional level 2-day workshop, and it's an image, and it follows really the same principles: collaborating, listening. So when I was at TRCA, I had been thinking about Indigenous youth and thinking about ways that Toronto Region Conservation Authority could support a program to have land-based teachings. And I had been speaking with Native Canadian Centre Toronto and Liat, and through NCCT, we met Elder Wabagoon, and together with Lucia Pacini, who was the manager of Bolton Camp, we founded Nikabi Dowd and Nagigweg. This is an image from the studio, but the premise was that the students learned from knowledge keepers and people from different disciplines about sustainable design and green infrastructure. This was the first summer. The students have came a long way, and they really enjoyed the hands-on experience, and we learned so much from them. This is an image of a design workshop that we did, Girls Can Too program out of Bolton Camp. So the youth came together to design a healing garden for children with anxiety and special needs at Bolton Camp. The other thing through teaching and through the work I do is to try to raise awareness of Indigenous issues. And this is a picture of Michael F. Daniels giving a talk to grad students and faculty. I've been fortunate to find funding for the Kairos blanket exercise for my classes. This is a picture from Ryerson. And inviting friends, Jim Adams with his naming project, Enokawin Waiowin. Trying to open up minds and have the students learn things in a different way. And they love it. Gawatqua, red spruce, the provincial tree of Nova Scotia. These trees can live 300 years old. It's a powerful medicine tree, and it's a symbol of resilience. Last summer, really fortunate, had no idea how fortunate to go to France. And this is a picture of my daughter, and we're in La Rochelle. These are medieval towers, and she's staring through the gate that our ancestors sailed through to go to the new lands at that time, the New World. And it just moved me to be able to see that time through landscape and the connection to my family. And I was thinking a lot about how we came to this work, how I came to this place, and that those trees that were growing back then, some of them are alive now. Migamagi, Lakedi, Grand Pre, this is where they landed. This is the home that they created out of the salt marshes, working closely with their Mi'kmaq family and friends. And this is the landscape now. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site on the Bay of Fundy. There are many people who don't know the story of the Acadians. I think, unfortunately, maybe we learned it, but it hasn't resonated. The Acadians were imprisoned by the British back in around 1775 for many reasons, and I can't go into the history of this right now. That's a whole other talk. But it made me think about how we were taken from the land that they had created, and from the families of the Mi'kmaq relatives. Some escaped because they were hidden and protected. About 15,000 Acadians were imprisoned, put on cattle ships, sent to colonies. Half of them didn't survive. Somehow my relatives, my ancestors went back. They live on the Acadian shore still. But it makes me think about where I come from, how I'm in this space. Why am I doing green infrastructure? Why do I fight for the things I fight for? This is a picture of the dike systems and the innovations that the Acadians actually created. And these systems function today, 300, almost 400 years later. They took about 150 years to create. The area became the breadbasket of l'Acadie. How can I use this approach of working together, green infrastructure, and carrying this on? And some of the things through my work as a landscape architect have been so helpful with my mentors and colleagues and friends to make this happen. And this is a picture of Pheasant Rump Nakota First Nation, who had heard about the Nikibidad and Nagigweg program and wanted us to work with them to help them think about their community in Saskatchewan and how they could be using green infrastructure. And we're still supporting this work through Dr. David Atkinson and Ryerson Urban Water. Indigenous people around the globe are thinking about their land back, about placemaking, about connecting and cultural resurgence. There's designer circles. There's so many ways to get involved and support this work of these important people. This is just an image from a retreat that I was on last summer. On my street, which is a curvy road, there's a creek that runs underneath. It's a lost river, and you can hear the water flow all year. It makes me sad, but it makes me happy at the same time. So I think a lot about how we as planners, landscape architects, people, humans can stand with water and land protectors. Where is the ancient knowledge that we need to support? Diana Beresford-Kroger, for example, writes in her film Call of the Forest, The Forgotten Wisdom of Trees. There's so much we can learn from Diana and help support and advocate for this knowledge so that it is heard. This is a medicine tour that was part of a consortium for Ontario Climate, the Ontario Climate Consortium. In Toronto, there's an effort right now to raise funds for the Great Red Oak, the Caring Place Trail. This tree could be the oldest tree in Toronto. We have to find ways to protect these trees, these elder trees. This one is of significance to the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation because of its location on the Humber River on the Carrying Place Trail, which was used by Indigenous peoples for time immemorial to travel. All citizens of Toronto should be concerned about protecting these. What about the rights of nature? How do we protect our trees across our country? Indigenous Spaces Healing Garden at Ted Rogers School of Management is a project that my students at Daniels and also at Ryerson are thinking about right now. The importance of plants teaching us, how can we create spaces that are healing for students as well and for staff, and what is the listening and the learning we can do from plants to bring into those spaces. We've been fortunate to visit the Name Res Medicine Wheel Garden in the West End and thinking about land-based teachings about Aki, the earth, and Mesquite, plants, medicines. Teaching landscape architecture and decolonizing planting design. We have to think about all our relations. Practice makes patience. It takes time to grow. It takes time for us to find ways to protect these creatures. This is a little bunny that we found at the Brickworks who needed to go to the Toronto Wildlife Rescue Center. We're fortunate to have those kinds of spaces in Toronto, people who care. Plants are among our oldest teachers, so we need to look to them for guidance. Robin Wall Kimmerer in her writings and her talks remind us of this. They are meshkiki, they're medicines, the strength of the earth. They heal the land. When I created SpruceLAB as a social enterprise, I wanted to prioritize Indigenous communities and voices and emerging professionals. I was thinking about these things. Spruce was they believe spruce was the tree, the medicine tree that helped cure scurvy of the earliest fur traders, possibly some of my ancestors. The roots of spruce are used as connectors for birch bark, for canoes, for cooking vessels. And the resin of the spruce tree is used as in a unique mixture that was innovated to create sparks as a fire starter. If there ever was a time for us to adapt our practice to spark conversations and to find the fire within, I think now is that time. Miigwech, Chi-miigwech, Walalin. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. Thanks for sharing. Thank you for sharing your journeys. You know, I've known you for a long time, but hearing your entire story, I think is giving me a new kind of insight into how how it's all come together, and these kinds of transformations and realizations in your own practice have come about. And I want to open up the questions for our participants, but I thought to maybe kick us off with one or two questions, if you don't mind. And the first question that I wanted to ask you has to do with plants, and it has to do with you. I mean, obviously, the field of landscape architecture, we study plants, also our cognate fields, whether it's environmental science or ecology, and we have some of these professions or these disciplines teaching in the landscape field as well. So there's always been a kind of a crossover. Plants are obviously a fundamental knowledge in landscape architecture. And I wonder if you could elaborate further on how you're seeing plants today through the lens that you've presented. and maybe some offering on how we might rethink our knowledge of plants, or the way that we're teaching plants, or the way that we regard plants in the landscape architecture profession. I know it's a big question because you've talked about it in so many different ways. But what would you say is the kind of the sort of the biggest paradigm shift that you might offer us here?
Well, I think the biggest thing to do is to shift our whole way of thinking about plants, their objects, that we need to start thinking of them as living creatures. And that, you know, some people say, we don't need to save the trees. The trees, the plants in the world will be fine without us. But we're understanding that actually this is not the way we have evolved. The plants, they need us to also help with them. And this is some of the writings that Robin Wall Kimmerer writes about, right? That by caring for plants in return, the plants respond. So I think we have been, the way most of us is not the way that Indigenous people have been taught, and have that understanding on a very deep level. So I think we need to shift the way we relate, that we are part of, we have a responsibility to care for plants and plant beings. And that if, you know, we don't, they turn their backs on us as well. I mean, that's the seventh fire, the prophecy of the seventh fire, animals and plants. If we do not hold up our relationships and our responsibilities, will turn their backs on us. And it's a bit, it's a big shift for people, because in landscape architecture, you know, traditionally we are taught ornamental plants in school and catalogs where we search through books, or we're taught about the forms of the plants and how they look, and how we move through space psychologically as humans, and we create public realm. But I don't think we get to that space where we are fundamentally creating conditions for plants to thrive, and that we have a responsibility to do that and think of their lifespan and connecting them. Like trees like to be together in communities. The roots, they talk to each other through the soils talk with the trees. There's so much evidence coming out that about this, that we just don't understand it. So how do we do that? I think, well, in our class, we're looking at observing plants, learning from plants. What is it that they do that's unique? How do they respond? How do they relate to other creatures? What are the things that are innovations that those plants have? Like biomimicry is building on that, more about the mechanics of it, but there's wisdom in plants, there's teachings as well, right? And I think we have a lot to learn by listening to the Indigenous elders in the writings about these things, like Wendy McCoon's Genius's book and her mother's book, and the naming of plants that came from what the plants did and how they are and the relationships around them, not just what they look like. So I think we have to shift.
I have to unmute myself. I want to also just highlight the fact of the kind of, in my view anyway, your visionary practice that you've committed to over so many years, that was not necessarily part of your job description in many cases, whether it was part of the City of Toronto, TRCA, and elsewhere. The projects that you have, where you highlighted the kind of social enterprise and the deep commitment to education and to reframing how everything is connected, the kind of concerns around green infrastructures that are also deeply tied with cultural engagement and cultural history and spiritual understanding of our place on Mother Earth. and our relationship, our kinship. These are things that you've taken on as sort of outside of I think the scope of much of the kind of the job descriptions. And I wanted to ask you first on whether you think that you're seeing a kind of a change in that approach, and in today's practice, and whether what you think would be the kind of the needs for our practice moving forward in that regard.
I'm not seeing enough of a change. I have a lot of concerns about that. I think we tend to rely on information that was developed too long ago, or we have blinders on about what we can and can't do. And it's easy to give up when you're trying to make change from within organizations that have very set ways of doing things. So because of where we are in these times, we need to be bolder, we need to be braver, and we need to find innovative strategic alliances around, I'm talking specifically resilience and climate change and protecting our waterways, our trees, and so on. Like, it's not easy to go against and to innovate, because it's never going to be part of your job description. And so you have to find ways of creating small successes, but getting the right direction and creating communities around those ideas as you move and do that work. And we need to find ways to do it faster. And I don't have an answer. I see there's positive change, but I don't think enough, because if we cared enough, we'd be putting more people on like green infrastructure, and you'd see more of it. You'd see trees and more soil. You'd see them. You'd see landscapes that were sponge parks. It wouldn't even be a question. We would just do it. So how do we get to the point where it's an accepted and there's no more, we don't have to keep doing little pilot projects to prove it each and every time. I'm more concerned right now about the value shift, because I believe that if you have the value system that you know that you need to do something, that you will work with smart people and to do it. And I've seen it happen. So how do we shift a culture that makes decisions? I don't know, some of it's going to be political, some of it's educational. But I think it takes people to speak up, and they might need to cause us more of a stir.
We have a question from one of the attendees. What might be some of your near future initiatives of SpruceLAB, and how has community engagement evolved for you during the pandemic?
Yeah, it's been slower. But we are working on some interesting initiatives. One of the projects I'm excited about is with Eladia Smoke Architects, and it's the Queen's University Indigenous Gathering Space, and that's just starting up. So I can't really speak to that other than I'm excited about it. And another one we are working on in an advisory capacity is the McMichael Canadian Art Collection up in Kleinburg with Public Work. And Nina Marie Lister is an advisor as well from Ryerson University. But I'm actually right at this point excited about the people who are joining the team and working closely with me, and strategically the alliances we're building. So there will be to come. And I can't speak to it exactly yet because it's not public, but I'm very excited about being more able to support conservation work in a way that involves Indigenous community leading and us supporting that. That's all I can say right now. That in permaculture, we're working with the idea of thinking about the green spaces in cities and how we can reimagine things like green roofs and small spaces that could be growing medicines and working in a way that helps urban Indigenous communities, but also just communities that live in high rises and may not have a backyard or a front yard. How can we be creative about not just stormwater, but hands-on contact with plants in a way that's very healing, and at the same time urban heat island mitigation and so on.
I'd like to invite others to submit their questions. Feel free to write them into the Q&A panel. Sheila, I wanted to also follow up with another question that I was thinking about in terms of where we are today with respect to First Nations engagement, community engagement and consultation relative to RFPs and landscape architecture projects that are happening that are calling for Indigenous placemaking, placekeeping, Indigenous engagement, community engagement, and where you think, if you could offer your sort of view or insight into where we are today with that, where you think perhaps even where the gaps are, or where you think what concerns you, what gives you hope. Yeah.
Well, the good thing is that because of the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, academic institutions specifically are looking for ways to create spaces for Indigenous students, staff, and also acknowledging traditional territories. And so you're seeing, and not just academics, but municipalities and governments as well, and even businesses. So like the Ted Rogers School of Management garden, healing garden, the rooftop garden space, for example. So this is all great. It's fun. It's amazing to see. But one of my concerns is that we are jumping on this without having people that are needing to lead it at the very earliest stages. So municipalities need to work very closely with elders and knowledge keepers and the treated rights holders, the First Nations of their land where they are, and to honor the land acknowledgements in a way that's deep and meaningful to start. But it's about changing the whole process. It's not just writing an RFP and then sending it out to the world and waiting for people to bid on it. It's about relationships, and it's about honoring traditional protocols. So we may need to change our practices. For example, it's not appropriate to consider an elder like a professional service because there's a traditional protocol in place for that. That is it's a sacred role. It's a spiritual guide. So in order to do that, to involve people, we need to ask the First Nations, Indigenous communities, how do you want to be involved? And what would be appropriate? What kinds of honoraria? And how do we incorporate that into our processes of whatever organization you're in, right? And how do we sustain that involvement with the community in a way that is, they lead the work and we support the work. So that's one thing. And there's I know at the City of Toronto is really helpful. They have an Indigenous Affairs Office, which was not there when I was there in 2017 when I left. So they're looking very closely at Indigenous placemaking across the city and ways, what is the community doing? What do they need support on? But there's still there's a real distrust of in general government. And so there's a lot of work to be done from, the colonial way of thinking. We need to change.
Mm-hmm. We have another question here. How do you translate the ecological or landscape point of view present in your methods and practice to your planning students who might not have as strong of a background in these topics and might have different assumptions about what constitutes quote unquote data?
Well, I'm thinking about how I approach the planning course I teach is green infrastructure. So it's very technical. to start off with. I mean, what is green infrastructure? What are the elements? Who's involved in the sector? And so on. What are the policies? How are the standards written to support it? And so it's very, very much factual. Where are the precedents in the world? Who's doing what? So the data is more about a case study analysis, but also qualitative in terms of what people are saying are the barriers and the challenges. And then, you know, we get into some of the data, I guess, about the stormwater management you can capture and how to quantify that through triple bottom line cost benefit analyses. Like we do talk about that. But I try to back off a little bit and think about, if green infrastructure is happening and we want it to happen, what are the skill sets we need to have to do this work? It's interdisciplinary work. It needs to be, we need to teach skills that help people work together in an integrated way. So I'm using things like practice stories where people do interviews where they listen very carefully on teams to hear and reflect and to learn from others and think about how that work, which is all green infrastructure related, can inform our work as practitioners. So again, it's a lot of qualitative at this point.
I'm not sure where the question was coming from, but I think about, you know, when I see the word data, I think about, you know, even questions of what do we even qualify as data, right? I mean, therein lies perhaps even the beginning of the problem, is that what we define as knowledge, what we define as data, who's it coming from, who's the author, who's narrating, you know, what are the terms by which something gets to be called data or gets to be analyzed and through which lens. And that in itself is an interdisciplinary issue, but also questions around values, right? And that is not necessarily always a disciplinary question, because as we know, the kind of their green infrastructure oftentimes falls in this kind of more of a scientific, a natural science / engineering realm of understanding its functionalities, but not really thinking about the points that the kind of the philosophical orientation that you've brought on. And I can imagine that the practice stories also challenge these notions of what we might think of as conventional data.
Yeah, and I have found that it depends on who you're speaking with, right? If the translation of the information, depending on the audience, so high performing landscapes and giving the information about the pollinator species and measuring changes over time, like we could do all of that, but will that change people? And I haven't seen it enough. So I do think it comes down to where you are resonating on an emotional level to make the change. And you back it up with the data. We know that it's happening. How many times do we have to measure it to show that it's happening? That biodiversity is a good thing. That urban heat island mitigation can happen through trees and green roofs. This data has been there a long time. The challenge and the problem has been in environmental work is the changing of perceptions and motivating people. That's where the social science work is really interesting, on, you know, understanding how we think and our cognitive biases and who you're working with so that you change your messaging to help deal with that.
Well, it reminds me of speaking to an environmental conservationist at some point who said to me that people are rarely motivated by environmental science and data, and that their communities come together and they're mobilized when it is an issue of quality of life, and when it's an issue that actually touches on, you know, touches communities in a way that is a more of a kind of a personal aspect, or where they think about their community as a whole. And that, you know, very difficult to mobilize people around stormwater data, even if they know that flooding occurs and it is an issue and it even has economic consequences that they could feel in their pockets. But still, the motivation is on is not through these metrics, but at a completely different level. So we have about 1 minute, I think. If there are there any further questions before we conclude our session this afternoon?
I just wanted to add that over the course of my career, the importance of having colleagues and mentors, and the gratitude I have for those people, because nothing any of us does is, you don't stand alone, right? It's important to acknowledge that and to give back.
Well, thank you, Sheila, for joining us today and sharing your story and stories and insight, and thanks for also this discussion, and for the audience for your questions. I'd also like to thank our Daniels programming committee and for organizing this year's series. And also a huge thank you, big gratitude to Nini Brody and Aidan, who have facilitated all the speakers information and technical aspects of delivering this program. And invite you all to see the rest of the Daniels events this term. Just go to the Daniels website and see under news and events what we have coming up. The next event, just so you know, is is part of the series called Takes Action. It is the second in the series, and it's coming up on this Wednesday, October 7th at 4 p.m. So we hope to see you all there, and thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon or evening. Thank you, Sheila, again.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
You as well.